As the sun began its descent over the 7 hills of Rome, the character of the ancient city underwent a profound transformation. The bustling energy of the morning marketplace, the heated debates of the forum, and the clamor of workshops and businesses gradually yielded to a different rhythm altogether. For the people of Rome, regardless of their station in life, the evening hours represented a sacred transition, a time when the demands of public life receded and the intimacy of domestic routines took center stage. The Roman conception of time itself differed markedly from our modern divisions of hours and minutes. Romans divided both day and night into 12 hours each, but these hours varied in length depending on the season. A daylight hour in summer was considerably longer than one in winter, and the opposite held true for nighttime hours. This flexible system meant that the evening arrived at different clock times throughout the year, but it always marked the same cultural moment: the shift from negotium, the world of business and public obligation, to odium, the realm of leisure, family, and personal restoration. For wealthy patricians living in spacious homes on the Palatine Hill, the evening promised refined pleasures and social engagement. For the plebeians crowded into the multi-story apartment buildings known as insulae, the evening meant a return to cramped quarters, perhaps a simple meal, and the early darkness that came with the inability to afford lamp oil in great quantities. Yet despite these vast differences in circumstance, certain rhythms united Romans across the social spectrum. Nearly everyone bathed, nearly everyone ate their main meal, nearly everyone honored their household gods, and nearly everyone eventually surrendered to sleep in the quiet hours before dawn. The evening routines of ancient Rome were shaped by practical realities that would seem foreign to modern sensibilities. There was no electricity to extend the day indefinitely, no refrigeration to preserve food across seasons, no central heating to ward off winter's chill. Romans adapted to these constraints with ingenuity and ritual, creating patterns of domestic life that endured for centuries. The soft glow of oil lamps, the warmth of braziers, the comfort of wool blankets, and the security of household shrines all played their part in easing the transition from the active world of daylight to the vulnerable state of sleep. Understanding these evening routines offers us a window into the private lives of Romans, the moments when they shed their public personas and inhabited the intimate spaces of home and family. While grand political events and military campaigns dominate the historical record, it is in these quiet domestic rhythms that we find the true texture of daily existence. Here, in the evening hours, we encounter Romans not as heroes or villains of empire, but as people seeking comfort, nourishment, connection, and rest at the end of each day. The evening in Rome was both universal and deeply personal. It followed patterns established over generations, yet each household adapted these patterns to their own circumstances and preferences. What remained constant was the understanding that this transition from day to night required attention, ritual, and care. The evening was not simply the absence of day, but a distinct realm with its own activities, meanings, and significance in the cycle of Roman life. The transition from day to dusk. As the afternoon hours advanced, the rhythm of Roman life began its gradual shift toward evening. For most Romans, this transition started not with the clock, but with the completion of the day's essential work. Business in the forum typically concluded by early afternoon, workshops fell silent as craftsmen set down their tools, and even the wealthiest citizens began to withdraw from their morning obligations of greeting clients and conducting affairs. This pattern reflected both practical necessity and cultural convention. The Romans, like many pre-industrial societies, structured their day around the natural progression of sunlight, concentrating their most demanding activities in the cooler morning hours. The movement toward evening was not abrupt, but gradual, marked by a series of subtle transitions. Markets began to thin as vendors sold their remaining goods or packed them away for the following day. The noise level in the streets, which had been considerable since dawn, began to shift in character. The sharp calls of merchants hawking their wares gave way to more casual conversation as people moved with less urgency. Children playing in the streets were called home by their mothers. Slaves hurried to complete final errands before darkness made the streets treacherous. For Romans of means, the late afternoon hours presented an opportunity they prized above nearly all others: the visit to the public baths. These magnificent complexes, known as thermae, or the smaller balneae, represented one of Rome's great gifts to civilization. By the imperial period, Rome boasted hundreds of bathing establishments, from modest neighborhood facilities to vast imperial complexes like the Baths of Caracalla, which could accommodate 1,600 bathers at once. The timing of bath visits followed a well-established pattern. Women typically used the baths in the early afternoon, while men arrived later, usually after the 9th hour, which corresponded roughly to mid-afternoon by our reckoning. The anticipation of the bath shaped the entire afternoon for many Romans. It was not merely a place to cleanse the body, but a social institution of profound importance, an essential component of what it meant to live as a civilized Roman. At the baths, senators might discuss politics with merchants, students could debate philosophy with their teachers, and neighbors could catch up on local gossip. The atmosphere was one of relaxed conviviality, where the formal hierarchies of the street and forum softened, if not entirely dissolved. The baths erased, at least temporarily, many of the rigid social hierarchies that governed Roman life. While separate facilities or hours might divide men from women, and while slaves entered through different doors to serve their masters, the basic experience of bathing was remarkably democratic. A wealthy patrician and a struggling shopkeeper might find themselves sharing the warm waters of the caldarium, their naked bodies revealing little about their respective stations in life. The scale and magnificence of the great imperial thermae testified to the importance Romans placed on bathing. These were not simple utilitarian structures, but architectural marvels that rivaled temples and palaces in their grandeur. The baths of Caracalla, completed in the early 3rd century, covered an area of over 30 acres and could serve more than 1,600 bathers simultaneously. Its soaring vaulted ceilings, intricate mosaic floors, and walls sheathed in colored marble created an environment of almost overwhelming luxury. Natural light streamed through vast windows in the caldarium, supplemented by the glow of numerous oil lamps as evening approached. Steam rose from the hot pools, creating an atmosphere that was both invigorating and dreamlike. Walking through these spaces, a Roman would have experienced a carefully orchestrated progression of sensations. The cool entrance halls gave way to progressively warmer rooms. The sound of conversation and laughter echoed off stone walls. The scent of olive oil, perfumes, and the faint sulphurous smell of the heated water mingled in the air. Underfoot, the floors varied from cool marble in the changing rooms to the almost burning heat of the caldarium's heated floor. The play of light and shadow, the splash of water, the calls of vendors selling snacks and drinks, the grunts of athletes in the exercise yards, all combined to create an environment that engaged all the senses. The physical progression through a Roman bath followed a sequence designed to invigorate both body and spirit. Upon entering, bathers would leave their clothing in the apoditerium, the changing room where they entrusted their garments to attendants or stored them in niches in the walls. From there, many chose to exercise in the palaestra, an open courtyard or covered hall where one could practice wrestling, play ball games, or engage in various athletic pursuits. This exercise served a practical purpose, working up a sweat that would make the subsequent bathing more effective at cleansing the skin. Following exercise, or sometimes preceding it, bathers would apply olive oil to their skin. This oil, stored in small vessels called ampullae, served multiple purposes. It helped loosen dirt and dead skin, provided a pleasant fragrance, and offered some protection against the intense heat of the hot rooms. Once oiled, the bather progressed through a carefully orchestrated sequence of temperatures. First came the tepidarium, a warm room that allowed the body to acclimate gradually to higher heat. The walls and floors of this room, like those of the caldarium to follow, were heated by the ingenious hypocaust system, in which hot air from furnaces circulated through spaces beneath the floor and within the walls. From the tepidarium, bathers advanced to the caldarium, the hot room. Here, temperatures could be intense enough that wooden sandals were necessary to protect the feet from the heated floor. The caldarium typically featured both dry heat, similar to a modern sauna, and steamy moisture. Large windows on the southern and western sides allowed sunlight to stream in, further warming the space. Bathers might linger here, allowing the heat to open their pores and promote sweating. When the heat became too intense, they could cool themselves at the labrum, a large basin filled with cold water positioned prominently in the room. After spending time in the heat, the bather would employ a strigil, a curved metal scraper, to remove the mixture of oil, sweat, and accumulated dirt from the skin. This was often done by slaves who had accompanied their masters to the baths, though some would scrape themselves or hire attendants for this purpose. The strigil was used with firm strokes along the contours of the body, and the material it removed testified to the effectiveness of the cleansing process. Fresh oil might be applied after this scraping, leaving the skin smooth and fragrant. The bathing sequence typically concluded with a visit to the frigidarium, the cold room, which featured a large pool of unheated water. The shock of plunging into cold water after the intense heat of the caldarium was considered both invigorating and healthful. Some bathers might alternate between hot and cold several times, while others limited themselves to a single immersion. The cold bath was thought to close the pores and seal in the benefits of the heat treatment, leaving the bather refreshed and renewed. Yet the baths offered far more than physical cleansing. These complexes often included gardens for strolling, libraries for reading, and halls for conversation and intellectual discourse. Vendors circulated through the premises, selling refreshments, snacks, and various services. The noise level could be considerable, as the philosopher Seneca memorably complained in a letter describing his unfortunate lodgings above a bathhouse. He detailed the grunts of weightlifters, the slaps of masseurs pounding clients' shoulders, the shrieks of those having underarm hair plucked, the cries of food vendors, and the splashing of swimmers, all combining into a cacophony that made study nearly impossible. Despite such complaints, or perhaps because of the very vitality they described, the baths remained central to Roman social life. Friendships were forged and maintained there. Business deals were discussed in the relaxed atmosphere of the warm pools. Political alliances were quietly negotiated. Young men displayed their athletic prowess, hoping to catch the eye of potential patrons. Scholars engaged in philosophical debates while lounging in the tepidarium. For many Romans, the daily visit to the baths was as essential as eating, and the thought of going without would have seemed almost barbaric. As the afternoon advanced toward evening, bathers began to leave the complexes, their skin glowing from the heat, their bodies relaxed, their minds refreshed. They would don their clothing, perhaps draping themselves in a fresh tunic brought for this purpose, and make their way toward home. The baths closed at dusk, their operating hours governed by the same solar rhythms that structured all of Roman life. Those who lingered too long risked finding themselves hustled out by attendants eager to begin the evening's cleaning and maintenance. The timing of bath visits was calibrated to leave ample time for the evening's central event, the cena, the main meal of the day. Romans believed strongly that one should not eat a substantial meal immediately after bathing, as the body needed time to cool and settle. Thus, the progression from bath to home to dinner table followed a natural sequence, each stage preparing for the next. The clean body, the relaxed muscles, and the pleasant fatigue of the baths set the stage for the enjoyment of food and company that would soon follow. The journey home, through darkening streets. As Romans departed the bathhouses and made their way home through the city streets, they entered a very different environment from the one they had known earlier in the day. The approach of evening brought with it an atmosphere that was simultaneously familiar and threatening. For while Romans moved confidently through their city by daylight, navigating its crowded streets and narrow alleys with ease, the coming of darkness transformed these same passages into places of genuine danger and uncertainty. The streets of Rome were not lit by public lamps or torches. Unlike some Greek cities that had experimented with street lighting, Rome relied entirely on what illumination the moon and stars could provide, supplemented occasionally by light spilling from open doorways or the torches carried by those wealthy enough to afford them. This meant that on moonless nights, or when clouds obscured the sky, the streets could become nearly pitch black. The dangers this darkness concealed were many and varied. Thieves and muggers prowled the unlit alleys, seeking victims to rob. Gangs of drunken young aristocrats might roam about looking for trouble, accosting passers-by for sport. Chamber pots were emptied from upper-story windows with little warning, their contents splashing onto the street below and anyone unfortunate enough to be passing. Loose cobblestones, open drains, and piles of refuse made walking treacherous even without the threat of human violence. The historian Jerome Carcopino captured the transformation that overtook Rome at nightfall in vivid terms. He described how night fell over the city like the shadow of a great danger, how everyone fled to their homes and barricaded the entrances, how shops fell silent and safety chains were drawn across doors, how shutters were closed and flower pots withdrawn from windows. This nightly retreat into fortified domesticity was not melodramatic exaggeration, but simple prudence. The streets after dark belonged to those who had reason to be abroad, the vigils, or night watchmen, who attempted to maintain some semblance of order, those returning from late dinner parties, criminals engaged in their nocturnal trades, and a few intrepid souls on urgent business. For wealthy Romans, the solution to navigating dangerous streets was to travel with an entourage. When a dinner party ran late into the evening, as the most elaborate ones often did, the host's departing guests would be accompanied by a retinue of slaves bearing torches to light the way and deter potential attackers. The sight of multiple torch-bearing slaves announced not only illumination, but wealth and power, discouraging all but the most desperate criminals. The torches themselves were simple constructions of resinous wood or cloth, soaked in pitch and wrapped around wooden staffs, but they provided essential light and served as potential weapons should the need arise. For those of more modest means, the options were grimmer. Many simply could not afford the oil needed for portable lamps or the materials for torches, and they certainly had no slaves to carry them. These individuals faced a choice: either complete their journey home before true darkness fell, or navigate the streets by feel and faint starlight, hoping to avoid danger through speed, caution, and luck. The fact that the vigils, Rome's combined police force and fire brigade, patrolled the streets from dusk until dawn offered some comfort, but their numbers were insufficient to monitor the vast expanse of the city comprehensively. One might walk many blocks without encountering a patrol, and even when patrols were nearby, their effectiveness against determined criminals or violent gangs was limited. The journey home thus became a race against darkness, and this urgency shaped the timing of evening activities. Those who bathed did so with an eye on the lengthening shadows. Those who had business to conduct in the late afternoon made sure to conclude it before the sun touched the horizon. Street vendors packed their goods away not merely because trade had slowed, but because remaining exposed on the streets after dark invited theft, or worse. The evening meal was timed to begin at dusk or shortly thereafter, ensuring that guests could arrive while some daylight remained, and if the dinner concluded at a reasonable hour, depart while the sky still held some faint illumination. The wealthy, of course, had less reason to concern themselves with these constraints. If a banquet at a senator's home extended well into the night, the guests could rely on their armed escort to see them home safely. The slaves who accompanied them, bearing torches and sometimes weapons, provided both light and security. Indeed, moving through the dark streets in such a retinue became a mark of status, a visible demonstration of one's resources and importance. The poor, observing these torchlit processions from their darkened windows, were reminded nightly of the gulf that separated them from Rome's elite. Yet even the wealthy could not entirely escape the atmosphere of menace that descended on the city with nightfall. Roman literature is filled with tales of nocturnal misadventures, of aristocrats assaulted despite their guards, of sedan chairs overturned by gangs, of torches extinguished by sudden downpours, leaving travelers stranded in hostile darkness. The Emperor Augustus himself, according to the historian Suetonius, was once attacked and nearly robbed while returning home from a dinner party. If even the emperor could be threatened, what hope had ordinary citizens? This nightly transformation of Rome's streets helps explain the Roman attitude toward evening activities. While Greeks celebrated their symposia, drinking parties that could extend far into the night, Romans generally preferred to conclude their social gatherings at more reasonable hours. The cena might be leisurely and elaborate, but it typically ended well before midnight, allowing guests to return home with some measure of safety. Those banquets that did extend into the small hours, like those hosted by the notoriously extravagant Emperor Nero, were remembered precisely because they violated this norm, keeping guests captive until dawn when the streets became safe again. For those who lived in ground-floor apartments or houses, the arrival home meant the immediate task of securing the premises against the dangers of the night. Doors were barred with heavy wooden beams, windows were shuttered tight, any valuables were hidden or locked away. The household itself became a fortress, a protected space within the larger uncertainty of the darkened city. This ritual of fortification was as much a part of the evening routine as bathing or dining, a necessary precaution in a world without streetlights or reliable policing. Yet alongside this defensive posture, there existed a quieter truth. For all its dangers, the Roman night also offered moments of profound beauty and peace. The city that was so loud and crowded by day became hushed and spacious under the stars. Those who were safely home could appreciate the coolness of the evening air flowing through their windows, the distant sound of a fountain in a courtyard, the soft glow of oil lamps creating pools of warm light against the darkness. The very dangers that made the streets threatening made the security of home all the more precious. To cross one's threshold at day's end was to achieve sanctuary, to enter a realm where the household gods watched over family, and hearth, where food and rest awaited, where the chaos of the city could be momentarily forgotten. Preparations for the evening meal. Once safely within the walls of home, Romans turned their attention to the preparations for cena, the main meal of the day. For this was not simply a matter of satisfying hunger, but a ritual of considerable social and cultural significance. The evening meal represented the central event around which the entire day pivoted, the moment when family gathered, when guests might be entertained, when the nourishment of both body and spirit took place. The preparations for such an occasion required thought, effort, and, in wealthier households, the coordinated labor of multiple slaves and servants. In patrician homes, the lady of the house would have been overseeing these preparations for much of the afternoon. While her husband attended the baths or concluded his business affairs, she directed the household staff in their various tasks. The kitchen, typically located away from the main living areas due to concerns about fire and cooking odors, became a hive of activity. Slave cooks and their assistants worked at preparing the various dishes that would comprise the meal, their efforts guided by recipes that might be simple or extraordinarily complex, depending on the household's wealth and the importance of the occasion. The Roman kitchen itself was a utilitarian space, designed for function rather than comfort or beauty. A raised hearth or series of hearths provided the heat for cooking, fueled by charcoal or wood that had been carefully selected for its burning properties. Charcoal was preferred for most cooking as it produced steady, controllable heat and less smoke than wood, though wood might be used for initial firing or for dishes that benefited from smoke flavoring. Large clay pots, some capable of holding several gallons, hung over these fires on iron hooks or sat nestled directly in the coals, their contents simmering slowly throughout the afternoon. Smaller braziers, portable and adjustable, allowed for more delicate cooking tasks that required careful temperature control. These might be used for sauces that could easily scorch, for gentle warming of foods, or for keeping prepared dishes at the proper temperature until serving time. The organization of heat sources and workspaces reflected the experience of generations of cooks who had perfected the art of managing multiple dishes simultaneously with limited equipment. The walls of the kitchen were typically blackened with soot, the accumulation of years of cooking fires that no amount of scrubbing could entirely remove. The air was thick with smoke that escaped as best it could through windows, doors, or sometimes through vents specifically designed for this purpose. In larger homes, the kitchen might have a raised chimney or smoke hood that helped draw fumes upward and out of the workspace, but many kitchens simply accepted smoke as an inevitable byproduct of cooking. The cooks and slaves who worked in these spaces developed a tolerance for the smoke, and the scent of wood smoke and cooking food that permeated their clothing became a mark of their profession. Despite these humble and sometimes harsh conditions, skilled cooks could produce remarkable dishes, drawing on a culinary tradition that incorporated ingredients and techniques from across the Mediterranean world and beyond. Roman conquests had brought exposure to Greek, Egyptian, and Near Eastern cuisines, and Roman cooks absorbed these influences while maintaining their own distinctive approaches. The result was a sophisticated culinary culture that valued both simple, honest flavors and complex, elaborate preparations depending on the occasion and the household's means. For a typical family dinner, the menu might be relatively simple. The appetizer course, called the gustatio, might consist of eggs, olives, small fish, and fresh vegetables from the household garden or purchased at the morning market. The main course, the prima mensa, would center on a meat dish if the household could afford it. Pork was the most common choice, as pigs were easier to raise than cattle and provided meat that was both flavorful and versatile. The meat might be roasted, stewed, or prepared with various sauces. Accompanying the meat would be vegetables, legumes, and bread, the fundamental staple of the Roman diet. The dessert course, called the secunda mensa, would offer fruits, nuts, and simple sweets, perhaps drizzled with honey. For more elaborate occasions, when guests were expected, the preparations became far more involved. Multiple dishes might be prepared for each course, offering variety and demonstrating the host's generosity and refinement. The appetizer table might feature not just simple olives and eggs, but shellfish, snails, exotic vegetables prepared with costly spices, and delicacies imported from distant provinces. The main course could include multiple meat dishes, each prepared differently, along with elaborate fish preparations, game birds, and vegetables cooked with intricate sauces. Dessert might feature not just local fruits, but imported delicacies, pastries sweetened with honey, and nuts prepared in various fashions. The preparation of these elaborate meals required not only skilled cooking, but also careful timing. Unlike modern kitchens with their precise temperature controls and timers, Roman cooks had to judge doneness by experience, adjusting their fires constantly, tasting frequently, and coordinating multiple dishes so that all would be ready at the proper moment. The head cook in a wealthy household was a valued slave, often educated and sophisticated, who commanded a staff of assistants and wielded considerable authority in the domestic hierarchy. While food preparation occupied the kitchen, other areas of the house required attention as well. The triclinium, the dining room, needed to be arranged for the meal. This room took its name from the 3 dining couches called triclinia that were arranged in a U shape around a central space where small tables would be placed. Each couch could accommodate 3 diners, reclining on their left sides, propped up on cushions, their right hands free to reach for food. The couches themselves needed to be prepared with fresh linens and properly arranged cushions. The room would be swept, fresh flowers might be brought in, and lamps would be positioned to provide adequate light without being intrusive. The arrangement of the dining couches followed a strict protocol based on social hierarchy and honor. The most prestigious position was on the middle couch at the right-hand end as one faced the room. This was where the most honored guest would recline, positioned so that he would be head-to-head with the host, who occupied the left-hand end of the left couch. Other guests were positioned according to their rank and relationship to the host, with each placement conveying subtle messages about esteem and favor. A Roman invited to dinner would be keenly aware of where he was asked to recline, interpreting his position as a measure of the host's regard for him. For those wealthy enough to entertain in this fashion, changing for dinner was an important ritual. Men would exchange their formal togas, which were required for public business but cumbersome and uncomfortable, for lighter garments called synthesis. These dining clothes were often colorful and made of comfortable fabrics designed to allow freedom of movement while reclining. Some sources suggest that diners might even remove their outdoor shoes and dine in light slippers or barefoot, adding to the atmosphere of relaxation and intimacy. Women of the household also prepared themselves for the meal, arranging their hair and donning appropriate garments. Unlike in Greek society, where respectable women were typically excluded from symposia and drinking parties, Roman women dined alongside the men, reclining on the couches with them. This was considered a mark of Roman virtue and the respected position of the Roman matron within her household. Children might also be present, though they typically sat on stools beside the couches rather than reclining, and they were served simpler fare from a separate table. In households of more modest means, the preparations were simpler but no less important. There might be no slaves to direct, no elaborate dishes to prepare, no guests to impress. The meal might be cooked by the lady of the house herself, working at a small brazier in the main living area, preparing simple porridge, vegetables, and bread. The family might eat while sitting rather than reclining, gathered around a simple table, or even taking their food while standing. Yet even in these humble circumstances, the evening meal retained its significance as the day's main event, the time when family gathered and nourishment was shared. Regardless of social station, wine was prepared for the meal. Romans drank wine at virtually every meal, but they almost never drank it undiluted. The practice of mixing wine with water was so fundamental to Roman culture that drinking unmixed wine was considered a sign of barbarism or alcoholism. The proportions varied according to preference and occasion. Common mixtures might be 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water, though stronger preparations were not unknown. The mixing was done in large vessels called craters, and from these the wine would be poured into individual cups as needed. Honey might be added to create mulsum, a sweetened wine particularly popular before and during meals. The preparation of the evening meal thus involved far more than simply cooking food. It required the coordination of household resources, the demonstration of hospitality and status, the maintenance of social hierarchies, and the creation of an atmosphere conducive to the pleasures of eating, drinking, and conversation. When all was ready, when the food was prepared, the dining room arranged, the wine mixed, and the household properly attired, the moment arrived to begin the cena itself, the ritual that stood at the very heart of Roman domestic life. The cena, Rome's central evening ritual. The evening meal, the cena, occupied a place in Roman life that transcended mere nourishment. It was a social institution, a family gathering, a demonstration of hospitality, and for the wealthy, a theater of status and refinement. The timing of the cena varied somewhat by season and individual habit, but it typically began in the late afternoon or early evening hours after bathers had returned home and allowed their bodies time to cool. This timing reflected the Roman day's structure, which began at dawn and concentrated most demanding activities in the morning and early afternoon, leaving the evening hours for the leisure and nourishment of the cena. The meal began with the gustatio, the appetizer course. This preliminary stage served multiple purposes beyond simply stimulating the appetite. It established the tone and quality of the meal to follow, offering the host an opportunity to display unusual or expensive items that would impress guests. The gustatio traditionally included eggs, which held symbolic significance as tokens of new beginnings and fertility. Oat. Alongside the eggs might appear olives, both green and black, preserved in brine or oil. Small fish, either fresh or preserved, were common, as were various vegetables. Lettuce was particularly popular as a gustatio item, as Romans believed it aided digestion and prepared the stomach for the heavier courses to come. For wealthier hosts, the gustatio became an opportunity for extravagance. Expensive shellfish might be served, including oysters, which were cultivated in beds along the coast and transported to Rome packed in seaweed and ice. Snails, another delicacy, might appear, fattened on special diets of milk and wine. Exotic vegetables and mushrooms, herbs and spices from distant provinces, costly garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans prized above nearly all other condiments. All these items could find their way on to the gustatio table. The presentation mattered as much as the food itself. Dishes were arranged artfully on platters of silver or fine pottery, garnished with fresh herbs, designed to please the eye as well as the palate. Accompanying the gustatio and flowing throughout the meal was wine. This initial service of wine was often mulsum, the honeyed wine that was sweeter and less intoxicating than regular wine preparations. Guests reclined on the couches, propping themselves on their left elbows, cushions supporting their bodies, and reached for food with their right hands. Eating utensils were minimal. Spoons were used for soups and sauces, and knives were employed for cutting, but most food was taken with the fingers. This required a certain delicacy and skill, as one needed to select and eat food while reclining at an angle, all without appearing crude or ungraceful. Between courses, slaves circulated with bowls of water and towels, allowing diners to rinse their hands. This was not merely a practical necessity, but part of the ritual of dining, a pause that allowed conversation to flow and anticipation to build for the next course. The conversation during these intervals was governed by complex social rules that every educated Roman understood implicitly. Topics might range from politics to philosophy, from literature to local gossip, but certain subjects were considered inappropriate for the dinner table. Discussions of business were generally avoided. The cena was a time for odium, for leisure and cultured discourse, not for the crude practicalities of commerce. Similarly, serious or contentious debates were discouraged. The meal was meant to be pleasant and harmonious, not confrontational. A skilled host would guide conversation toward topics that allowed all guests to participate and display their wit or learning without creating awkward silences or heated arguments. The art of dinner conversation was considered an important social skill, one that marked the difference between a mere peasant filling his belly and a cultivated person engaging in the full experience of civilized dining. Romans valued the ability to speak eloquently but not pedantically, to display knowledge without showing off, to make witty remarks without causing offense, and to listen as well as speak. Young men from good families were trained in rhetoric partly to prepare them for these social settings, where the ability to converse well could advance one's career and reputation as effectively as any formal speech in the forum. The selection of dinner companions itself was a matter requiring careful thought. A Roman hosting a dinner party would consider not just who should be invited, but how the various guests would interact with one another. Incompatible personalities might be kept separate, while those likely to stimulate interesting conversation would be placed near each other on the couches. The dynamics of Roman social life, with its complex web of patronage, obligation, and alliance, played out in microcosm at the dinner table, and a host who consistently assembled congenial and interesting company would earn a reputation for hospitality that enhanced his standing in society. Following the gustatio came the prima mensa, the main course. This was the heart of the meal when the most substantial dishes appeared. For most Romans, this meant some form of meat or fish, accompanied by vegetables, legumes, and bread. Pork, as mentioned earlier, was the most common meat, prepared in countless ways. It might be roasted whole, the skin crisped and crackling. It might be cut into pieces and stewed with vegetables and herbs. It might be made into sausages mixed with spices and stuffed into casings. The head of a pig, when served whole, was considered a particular delicacy, and various parts of the animal that modern sensibilities might reject, the ears, the feet, the liver, the intestines, were all utilized and prized. For those who could afford it, other meats expanded the possibilities. Lamb and goat were available, though less common than pork. Chicken and other poultry appeared regularly on Roman tables, valued for their versatility and the relative ease of raising them. Game birds, when they could be obtained, were highly prized. Wild boar represented the pinnacle of luxury for meat dishes, associated with hunting and aristocratic leisure. Beef was relatively rare, as cattle were more valuable as draft animals, and for their milk than for their meat, and the Romans generally considered beef somewhat coarse compared to other meats. Fish, both from the sea and from rivers, played a major role in Roman cuisine. The Mediterranean provided an abundance of varieties, from small sardines and anchovies to larger tuna and swordfish. Mullet was particularly prized, as were various shellfish. The Romans developed sophisticated methods of preserving fish through salting, pickling, and fermenting, allowing seafood to be enjoyed even by those living far from the coast. The fish sauce, called garum, made by fermenting fish in salt for several months, became perhaps the most characteristic flavoring of Roman cuisine. added to dishes in the way that soy sauce might be used in Asian cooking. The preparation of the prima mensa dishes showcased the skills of Roman cooks. Elaborate sauces might be prepared, combining sweet and savory elements, incorporating imported spices like pepper from India, cinnamon from the East, and silphium from North Africa. The Romans were not afraid of strong, complex flavors, and their cuisine often combined elements that modern palates might find unusual: honey with vinegar, fruit with meat, fish sauce with wine. Presentation remained important. A roasted pig might be brought in whole, or a large fish might be displayed before being carved. For the wealthiest hosts, the presentation could be theatrical. The satirist Petronius described in his fictional Dinner of Trimalchio such absurdities as a roasted pig stuffed with live birds that flew out when it was carved, and dishes arranged to represent the 12 signs of the zodiac. Accompanying the prima mensa were various vegetable dishes and bread. Romans ate many of the same vegetables we know today: lettuce, cabbage, onions, garlic, leeks, beets, turnips, radishes, and cucumbers. They also cultivated peas, beans, and lentils, which provided important protein for those who could not afford meat regularly. These vegetables might be served raw in salads, boiled, roasted, or prepared with sauces. Bread came in many forms, from coarse whole grain loaves eaten by the poor to fine white bread made from carefully sifted flour reserved for the wealthy. The bread served at dinner was often fresh from the household's own oven, or purchased that day from a commercial bakery. Throughout the prima mensa, wine continued to flow, now usually the regular wine mixed with water rather than the sweet mulsum of the appetizer course. The ratio of wine to water might be adjusted as the meal progressed, and the choice of wines could vary according to the host's means and the importance of the occasion. Ordinary table wine, suitable for everyday consumption, could be purchased relatively cheaply. Fine vintages from particular regions or estates commanded premium prices and were reserved for special occasions and honored guests. The serving of wine was attended by the same care as the serving of food. It was poured from elaborate vessels, offered first to the most honored guests, and accompanied by toasts and conversation. After the prima mensa was cleared away, the final course arrived, the secunda mensa. This dessert course was typically lighter and simpler than what had come before. Fresh fruits dominated: apples, pears, grapes, figs, cherries, plums, and others depending on the season. Dried fruits, particularly figs and dates, were available year-round. Nuts of various kinds might be offered: walnuts, almonds, chestnuts, and hazelnuts. These items were often served with honey, which was the primary sweetener available to Romans. Honey cakes and pastries might appear, though they were generally simpler than modern desserts, as the Romans lacked both sugar and many of the elaborate baking techniques developed in later centuries. The secunda mensa marked a transition in the meal. It was often during this course that entertainment began, if it had not already started. Musicians might play flutes or lyres, providing a pleasant background. Singers might perform songs, either traditional or newly composed. In wealthier households, professional entertainers might be brought in: dancers, acrobats, actors performing short comedic scenes, or poets reciting their verses. The entertainment was meant to enhance the convivial atmosphere, not to dominate it, and conversation remained the primary activity. The length of the cena varied enormously depending on the occasion and the participants. A simple family dinner might conclude within an hour or two. A formal banquet with multiple guests could extend for 4 or 5 hours or even longer. The Emperor Nero was notorious for hosting dinners that lasted from early evening until dawn, though such excesses were generally condemned by more austere Romans as signs of decadence and moral decay. Most dinner parties concluded at a reasonable hour, allowing guests to depart while the streets still retained some measure of safety. For the poor, the cena was necessarily simpler but no less significant. Without slaves to prepare elaborate dishes or the money to purchase expensive ingredients, they relied on simpler fare. A typical meal might consist of poles, a thick porridge made from wheat or other grains, boiled and seasoned with a little oil, salt, and whatever vegetables or bits of meat might be available. This porridge, filling and nutritious if monotonous, had been the staple of Roman diet since ancient times and remained the foundation of meals for those of modest means. Bread, cheaper cuts of meat when available, beans and lentils, and simple vegetable dishes rounded out the meal. Wine, even for the poor, was usually present, though of rougher quality and perhaps more heavily watered. The poor might eat while sitting rather than reclining, and their meals might be consumed more quickly, but the evening meal remained the central event of their day, the time when family gathered and the day's labors were set aside. Regardless of social station, certain customs attended the cena. It was traditional to offer a portion of the meal to the household gods before eating, a ritual that acknowledged the divine protection of home and family. Conversation, whether elevated philosophical discourse among intellectuals or simple talk among family members, accompanied the meal. The cena was not simply about filling the stomach, but about nurturing relationships, maintaining social bonds, and participating in the civilized ritual of shared food and drink. When the meal finally concluded, when the last course had been enjoyed and the final toast offered, Romans could turn their attention to the other rituals and activities that would occupy the remaining evening hours before sleep. Household religious observances. After the completion of the evening meal, or sometimes integrated into it, came a set of religious observances that were fundamental to Roman household life. Unlike the grand public ceremonies conducted in temples and forums, these domestic rituals were intimate and personal, conducted not by professional priests, but by the head of household, the paterfamilias, or sometimes by other family members. These observances connected each Roman home to the divine forces believed to protect and sustain it, maintaining what the Romans called the pax deorum, the peace with the gods that was essential for prosperity and well-being. At the center of household religious life stood the lararium, the household shrine. In wealthier homes, this might be an elaborate structure, a small temple-like construction housed in the atrium, the main reception room of the house. In more modest dwellings, the lararium might be nothing more than a small niche in a wall, a corner shelf, or even a simple painted representation on a wall. Archaeological excavations at Pompeii and Herculaneum have revealed hundreds of these household shrines, preserving for us their appearance and arrangement across various levels of society. The lararium typically housed small statues or painted images of the household gods. The most important of these were the lares, protective spirits associated with the family and the physical space of the home. These were often depicted as young men in tunics holding drinking horns and bowls. The exact nature of the lares was somewhat ambiguous even to the Romans themselves. Some believed them to be deified ancestors, others saw them as purely spiritual guardians, still others thought of them as the numinous presence of the household itself made manifest. What remained constant was the understanding that these spirits watched over the family, protected it from harm, and needed to be honored with regular offerings and prayers. Alongside the lares stood the penates, gods of the household stores and provisions. These deities ensured that the family had sufficient food and that the household prospered materially. While the lares protected the home and family members themselves, the penates concerned themselves with the practical necessities of daily life. In practice, the distinction between lares and penates was often blurred, and many Romans simply honored the household gods, collectively without worrying over much about precise classifications. Many lararia also included representations of other deities. Vesta, goddess of the hearth, was frequently honored, as the hearth represented the literal and symbolic heart of the home. Janus, god of doorways and transitions, might be invoked to protect the household's thresholds. Individual families might also include images of their patron deities, gods or goddesses to whom they felt particular devotion. The genius of the paterfamilias, the divine spirit embodying his generative power and role as family protector, might also be represented, often shown as a toga-clad figure holding a bowl and making an offering. In front of these divine images stood a small altar where daily offerings were made. The nature and timing of these offerings varied somewhat by household, but certain patterns were common across Roman society. At the lararium, a small oil lamp called a lucerna was kept burning. This sacred flame represented both an offering to the gods and the presence of the gods themselves. Maintaining this flame was an important duty, usually assigned to a specific household member, often a trusted slave. The lamp needed to be filled with oil, its wick trimmed, and it was typically lit fresh each evening. The evening meal itself provided the occasion for offerings to the household gods. Before the family ate, a portion of the food would be set aside for the gods. This might be done by casting a small amount into the household fire, if one was burning, or by placing food on the altar of the lararium. Bread, wine, and salt were common offerings, representing the fundamental necessities of life. On special occasions, more elaborate offerings might be made, cakes made with flour and honey, milk, olive oil, or incense. The act of making offerings was accompanied by prayer. The form of these prayers varied, but they generally followed a structure that was both formal and intimate. The worshiper might cover his or her head with a fold of the toga or a veil, a gesture that indicated the solemn nature of the ritual. Standing before the lararium, hands raised with palms upward toward the divine images, the worshiper would invoke the gods by name. A typical evening prayer might run something like this: "In layers of our household, we honor you with these offerings. We thank you for watching over our home and family through this day. We ask that you continue to protect us through the night. Keep danger from our threshold, keep illness from our beds, keep want from our stores. Accept these gifts as tokens of our devotion." The prayers did not necessarily need to be in Latin, despite what later reconstructions might suggest, though Latin added a certain formality. What mattered more than the language was the sincerity of the offering and the maintenance of proper ritual form. If a mistake was made in the wording of a prayer, it needed to be restarted from the beginning, as the gods would only honor prayers that were correctly performed. This attention to ritual precision was characteristic of Roman religion, which emphasized right practice more than right belief. After the prayer and offering, the worshiper might linger for a moment in silent contemplation or private petition. The household gods were not distant, abstract forces, but intimate protectors who took interest in the daily concerns of family members. A mother might ask the lares to watch over a sick child. A merchant might seek their blessing for an upcoming business venture. A student might request their aid in memorizing his lessons. These personal appeals did not require formal ritual but could be offered in the quiet of one's own thoughts, trusting that the household gods, ever present, would hear and respond. The evening offering to the household gods was often supplemented by other small rituals throughout the day. In the morning, fresh oil might be poured into the sacred lamp, and a brief prayer of thanks offered for the night's safe passage. Special occasions demanded special observances. Birthdays, anniversaries, departures on journeys, safe returns, business successes, marriages, births, and deaths all called for particular rituals at the lararium, often involving more elaborate offerings, longer prayers, and the gathering of the entire household. The responsibility for maintaining the household cult fell primarily to the paterfamilias, but other family members participated actively. The matron of the household had her own religious duties, particularly concerning Vesta and the maintenance of the hearth fire. Children learned the household rituals from infancy, absorbing through daily observation the proper forms of prayer and offering. As they matured, they took on more active roles, with older children sometimes being entrusted with lighting the sacred lamp or preparing the offerings. Slaves, too, had a place in the household cult, though their status was somewhat ambiguous. They were members of the household and thus under the protection of the household gods, but they were also property rather than family in the full sense. Nevertheless, they often participated in household rituals, and many sources suggest that slaves developed genuine devotion to the lares and penitties of their master's house. Some large households maintained separate shrines for the slaves, acknowledging their particular position and needs. The household cult was intimately connected to ideas about the family and its continuity across generations. The lares were often understood as ancestral spirits, and honoring them meant honoring the family's past and ensuring its future. When a son came of age, he would dedicate his childhood bulla, a protective amulet worn around the neck, to the household lares, marking his transition to adult status under their continued protection. When a daughter married and left her natal household, she would transfer her allegiance to her husband's household gods, bringing coins to offer them as a sign of her acceptance into a new family. Beyond the daily routine of offerings, there were also annual festivals that required household observance. The Compitalia, celebrated at the New Year, honored the lares of the neighborhood crossroads, but also involved household observances. Parentalia in February was dedicated to honoring deceased family members, requiring visits to family tombs and offerings at the household shrine. Lemuria in May involved rituals to appease potentially dangerous spirits of the dead, conducted at midnight by the paterfamilias, who walked barefoot through the house, casting black beans over his shoulder and invoking protective formulas. These household religious observances existed in parallel with public religious participation. Romans attended temple ceremonies, participated in public festivals, and observed the state cult with its grand sacrifices and elaborate rituals. But it was the household cult that touched their lives most intimately and regularly. The public religion might call for occasional participation, but the household gods required daily attention. The relationship between a Roman family and its lares and penates was ongoing and reciprocal. The gods protected the household honored the gods with regular offerings and prayers. This mutual obligation, this contractual relationship with the divine, stood at the heart of Roman religious sensibility. As evening advanced toward night, the glow of the sacred lamp at the lararium provided a reassuring point of light. The offerings had been made, the prayers spoken, the gods honored. The household had fulfilled its obligations, and in return could trust in divine protection through the vulnerable hours of darkness. With these rituals completed, Romans could turn to other evening pursuits, secure in the knowledge that the spiritual foundations of their home remained strong and properly maintained. Evening activities and quiet pursuits. After the completion of the cena and the evening religious observances, a period of the evening remained before Romans retired to bed. How this time was spent varied enormously depending on social station, personal inclination, and the season of the year. For many, particularly those of modest means, the coming of full darkness meant the end of productive activity, as the cost of lamp oil made extended evening hours prohibitively expensive. These Romans might spend a short while in quiet conversation with family members or in preparing items for the following day, before retiring to bed while some twilight still lingered. For the wealthy, however, who could afford abundant illumination, the evening hours offered opportunities for leisure, cultivation, and social engagement. Reading was a favored evening activity among the educated classes. The Romans, particularly during the late Republic and early Empire, developed a sophisticated literary culture that valued both the creation and consumption of texts. Works of history, philosophy, poetry, and rhetoric circulated widely among the literate minority, and evenings offered time to engage with these materials. Unlike modern reading, which is typically a solitary and silent activity, Roman reading was often performed aloud, sometimes to an audience. A wealthy Roman might read to his family or have a slave trained in proper recitation read to the assembled household. This practice transformed reading into a social activity, allowing the illiterate to participate in literary culture and creating shared experiences around texts. The conditions for evening reading were quite different from what we know today. Oil lamps provided the only illumination after dark, and these produced a relatively dim, flickering light compared to modern electric lighting. Multiple lamps would be arranged around the reader to provide adequate light. But even so, reading by lamplight was more challenging than reading by daylight. The eyes tired more quickly, and the quality of the light meant that copying or writing was even more difficult than simple reading. Seneca complained about those who studied late into the night, noting that they breathed in soot from the lamps, suggesting that health concerns accompanied the practical difficulties of reading after dark. Despite these challenges, some Romans made a point of pursuing intellectual work in the evening hours. Pliny the Younger, whose letters provide a detailed picture of upper-class Roman life, described his evening routine of study and composition. After dinner, he might dictate letters or work on his speeches, or he might simply read and reflect on philosophical texts. This dedication to evening study was seen as admirable, a mark of serious commitment to learning and self-cultivation. The phrase "smelling of the lamp" developed to describe writing that showed signs of laborious nocturnal composition, sometimes used admiringly, sometimes critically depending on whether the effort produced polished work or pedantic overthinking. Writing itself was a common evening pursuit for those who engaged in literary or administrative work. The tools of writing were simple but required skill to use effectively. Wax tablets, consisting of wooden frames filled with a thin layer of wax, were used for temporary notes, drafts, and ephemeral communications. A stylus with a pointed end for inscribing and a flattened end for smoothing the wax allowed for easy correction. For more permanent writing, papyrus or parchment was used, with ink applied by reed pens. The production of finished text required careful attention and steady hands, as mistakes were difficult to correct. Wealthy Romans employed trained scribes for important documents, but personal letters and informal writings might be produced by the writer himself, particularly in the evening hours when there was time for such detailed work. Conversation remained perhaps the most universal evening activity across all social classes. For the wealthy, this might take the form of sophisticated philosophical discussion, debates about literature or politics, or the exchange of gossip and news. Dinner parties frequently extended beyond the meal itself, with guests remaining to talk, their conversation lubricated by wine and encouraged by the relaxed atmosphere of the dining room. These conversations could range from light banter to serious intellectual discourse, depending on the participants and the mood of the evening. For families, evening conversation served different purposes. Parents might discuss household matters, make plans for the coming days, or review the events of the day just past. Children might share their experiences, ask questions, or listen to stories told by elders. Storytelling was an important form of family entertainment, with traditional tales, historical anecdotes, and family histories passed down through oral repetition. These stories served educational purposes, transmitting cultural values and family identity, while also providing entertainment in the hours before bed. Music represented another common evening activity, particularly in households that could afford instruments and had members trained to play them. The lyre and the flute were popular instruments, and their soft tones were well suited to intimate evening settings. Music might accompany singing, with participants performing traditional songs or contemporary compositions. In wealthier households, professional musicians might be retained to perform, though more commonly musical entertainment was provided by family members or educated slaves who had been trained in music as part of their general cultivation. Board games and gambling offered evening entertainment across all social classes. The game of Latrunculi, somewhat similar to chess or checkers, involved moving pieces on a board to capture opponents' pieces and required strategic thinking. Dice games were enormously popular, despite periodic official efforts to ban them. Romans gambled on dice throws, on board games, on knucklebones, and on virtually anything else that offered the possibility of chance outcomes. The stakes might be small or large, and the activity might be casual play among friends or serious gambling that could lead to significant losses. The appeal of these games lay partly in their element of chance, and partly in the social interaction they facilitated. For some Romans, evening hours might be devoted to various crafts or productive activities. Women particularly engaged in spinning and weaving, activities that were considered virtuous and appropriate for Roman matrons. These tasks could be accomplished by lamplight and required little space, making them suitable for evening work. The production of cloth was a continual necessity in Roman households, and the work of transforming raw wool or flax into usable fabric occupied many hours. While slaves might perform much of this labor in wealthy households, the mistress of the house was expected to participate, demonstrating her industry and domestic virtue. Men might use evening hours for account keeping, reviewing the records of their business affairs, planning transactions, or composing letters on business matters. Despite the Roman preference for keeping business separate from leisure, practical necessities sometimes demanded attention even in the evening hours. A merchant might review his accounts, a landowner might plan agricultural operations for his estate, a politician might draft correspondence to allies or constituents. These activities were typically concluded as quickly as possible, however, as the evening was ideally reserved for odium rather than negotium. In modest households where oil for lamps was scarce, the evening activities were necessarily limited. Families might gather around a single lamp or small fire, using the light for essential tasks while it lasted. Children might be put to bed early to reduce the need for lighting. Adults might prepare items for the following day, mend clothing, sharpen tools, or engage in other tasks that could be accomplished in dim light or by feel. Conversation remained the primary activity, though when the lamp was extinguished and darkness complete, conversation too would fade, and the household would settle into sleep. The wealthy, freed from such constraints, might keep their evening activities going later into the night. Particularly after an elaborate dinner party, guests might remain for hours, their conversation fueled by wine and the pleasure of company. Some hosts became famous for the extent and quality of their evening entertainment. Private theatrical performances, poetry readings by acclaimed authors, philosophical lectures, musical performances, all these might be offered to guests. The Emperor Augustus, despite his generally austere habits, was known to enjoy theatrical performances and would sometimes arrange for actors to perform at his residence in the evening. For many Romans, the evening also offered time for personal religious devotion beyond the formal household rituals. Individuals might spend time in private prayer, meditation on philosophical or religious texts, or preparation for participation in public religious ceremonies. The mysteries of various Eastern religions, which gained popularity in the imperial period, often involved evening or nocturnal rituals. The cult of Isis, for instance, included evening prayers and observances that devotees would perform privately in their homes. As the evening advanced toward the hour for sleep, these various activities would wind down. The lamps would be extinguished one by one, the fires allowed to die to coals, the household members dispersing to their sleeping areas. The transition from waking activity to sleep was gradual rather than abrupt, a gentle yielding to the natural rhythm of darkness and the body's need for rest. In this quiet time, the city outside fell silent, and each household became an island of dim light and soft sound before finally surrendering to the darkness of the Roman night. The art of Roman illumination. The capacity to extend productive activity beyond sunset depended entirely on artificial lighting, and the technology and economics of illumination shaped the rhythms of Roman evening life in profound ways. Unlike the modern world, where electric lighting is ubiquitous and cheap, Romans faced significant challenges in creating light after darkness fell. The primary source of evening illumination was the oil lamp, a technology that had been perfected over centuries, but which remained relatively expensive and inefficient by modern standards. Roman oil lamps were crafted from clay, metal, or occasionally glass, with clay being the most common material for everyday use. These lamps consisted of a rounded body to hold the oil, a filling hole at the top, and a nozzle or spout where the wick emerged. The design evolved over time, becoming increasingly refined and sophisticated. Early lamps were simple open saucers with the rim pinched to form a crude spout, but by the imperial period, lamps featured closed bodies with decorative lids and carefully formed nozzles. The body of the lamp, particularly the top surface called the discus, often bore decorative motifs: gods and goddesses, mythological scenes, animals, geometric patterns, or erotic imagery. The fuel for these lamps was olive oil, the most common and readily available oil in the Mediterranean world. Olive oil provided a relatively clean, steady flame compared to animal fats or fish oils, which some poorer Romans were forced to use and which produced thick smoke and unpleasant odors. The cost of olive oil, while lower than many luxury goods, still represented a significant household expense, particularly if multiple lamps needed to be kept burning for extended periods. This economic reality meant that for many Romans, the use of lamps was rationed carefully, with only essential illumination provided. The wick of a Roman lamp was typically made of linen, flax, or other fibrous materials. It lay partly submerged in the oil within the lamp's body and extended through the nozzle to be lit. As the wick burned, it drew oil up by capillary action, maintaining the flame. The wick needed regular attention. As it burned down, it had to be pulled forward to keep it from falling back into the oil. If the wick became charred and crusty, it needed to be trimmed or replaced entirely. These maintenance tasks were ongoing through an evening of lamp use, and failure to attend to them would result in a guttering, smoky flame that provided poor light. The light produced by a single oil lamp was quite modest compared to modern lighting. A typical Roman lamp might provide illumination roughly equivalent to a single birthday candle, meaning that multiple lamps were necessary for most activities. Reading would require several lamps positioned around the page. Dining rooms were lit with numerous lamps placed on stands or in wall niches. Wealthy households might use dozens of lamps simultaneously, their combined light creating an adequate, if flickering, illumination. The poorest households might make do with a single lamp, carefully tended and used only for essential tasks. The arrangement and positioning of lamps required thought and effort. Small portable lamps could be carried from room to room as needed, their handles allowing them to be grasped without touching the hot clay body. Larger lamps sat on stands or tables, positioned to cast light where it was most needed. Wall niches, purpose-built into many Roman homes, provided safe places to set lamps at various heights. Elaborate candelabra, sometimes rising several feet high with multiple arms for holding lamps, served both functional and decorative purposes in wealthy homes. The interplay of multiple small flames created pools and shadows of light, a very different visual environment from the even illumination of electric lighting. Candles represented an alternative to oil lamps, though they were generally less common in Roman households. Roman candles were made from tallow, animal fat that was melted and poured around a fibrous wick, then allowed to harden. These tallow candles had been invented by the Romans and represented an innovation in lighting technology, but they had significant drawbacks. Tallow candles produced more smoke and odor than oil lamps, and the quality of light they provided was less steady. They were, however, more portable and required less maintenance than lamps, making them useful for certain applications. Beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and brighter, existed but were expensive luxury items, generally reserved for religious purposes or the very wealthy. For outdoor movement at night, torches provided necessary illumination. A torch was simply a wooden staff wrapped with cloth or pitch-soaked material that would burn for a considerable time. Torches produced bright light and could be carried easily, but they also produced smoke, sparks, and the constant danger of setting something ablaze. For wealthy Romans moving through the city at night, slaves would carry torches to light the way, their number indicating the status of the person they escorted. A great man might be preceded by multiple torchbearers, their flames announcing his approach and deterring potential threats. The maintenance of all these various light sources required ongoing effort and expense. Lamps needed to be filled regularly with oil, their wicks trimmed and replaced, their bodies cleaned of accumulated soot and residue. Oil had to be purchased and stored. Wicks needed to be made or acquired. Candles needed to be produced or bought. For wealthy households with many lamps, specialized slaves might be assigned to lamp maintenance, ensuring that lamps were always ready for use. In more modest households, this work fell to the housewife or other family members. The economics of lighting created a fundamental division in how evenings could be used. For the wealthy, abundant lighting meant that evening activities could extend late into the night. Reading, writing, conversation, games, and other pursuits could continue for hours after sunset. For the poor, the cost of fuel meant that evening illumination was severely limited. A single lamp might be lit for necessary tasks, then extinguished to conserve oil. This economic reality reinforced other social divisions, as the wealthy literally had more hours in which to cultivate themselves, conduct business, and enjoy leisure, while the poor were constrained by darkness to shorter productive days. Despite these limitations, Romans managed to create remarkably sophisticated and pleasant environments for evening activities. The soft, warm light of oil lamps had aesthetic qualities that were appreciated. even if the illumination was less bright than daylight. The flames flickered and danced, creating a sense of movement and life. When perfumed oils were burned in lamps, as sometimes occurred in wealthy households, the air would be scented as well as illuminated. The combination of light, warmth from braziers or hearths, and the gathering of family or friends created a sense of intimacy and comfort that helped compensate for the limited brightness. The importance of fire and light extended beyond mere practicality into the symbolic and spiritual realm. Light was associated with life, safety, and divine presence. Darkness represented danger, uncertainty, and the realm of potentially malevolent spirits. Maintaining the sacred flame at the household lararium was both a practical necessity for evening rituals and a symbolic act that kept divine protection present in the home. The Vestal virgins in Rome tended the eternal flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, and allowing this flame to go out was considered a catastrophic omen. Every household flame echoed this greater flame, connecting individual homes to the religious and cultural heart of Rome. As the evening progressed and the hour for sleep approached, the lamps would be gradually extinguished, leaving perhaps one or two burning to provide minimal light through the night. Some households kept a lamp burning near the entrance as a deterrent to thieves or to provide light if someone needed to move through the house during the night hours. Others extinguished all lamps completely, trusting to the darkness and their barred doors to keep them safe. The transition from the illuminated evening to the dark night marked a final boundary before sleep, a surrendering of human activity to the natural cycle of darkness and rest. Preparing the body for sleep. As the evening activities drew to a close and the hour grew late, Romans turned their attention to preparing themselves and their sleeping spaces for the night's rest. This preparation, while simpler than many modern bedtime routines, nonetheless involved a series of customary practices aimed at ensuring comfortable and restorative sleep. The nature and extent of these preparations varied considerably by social class, but certain elements were common across Roman society. For those who had attended the baths earlier in the evening, the body was already clean, but various preparations still remained. Wealthy Romans might have slaves apply scented oils or perfumes to the skin before bed, creating a pleasant fragrance and softening the skin. Some evidence suggests that Romans might wash their hands and face before retiring, using water that had been set aside for this purpose. A basin of water might be kept in or near the bedroom for this evening ablution, along with clean cloths for drying. The clothing worn for sleeping differed somewhat from daytime garments. Men typically slept in their tunics, the same undergarment worn during the day, though they might change into a clean tunic kept specifically for sleeping. The tunic provided a layer between the sleeper and the bedding, offered some warmth, and maintained a degree of modesty. Some sources suggest that on warm summer nights, particularly in the privacy of one's own bedroom, Romans might sleep naked, but this was not the usual practice. Women likewise wore tunics or loose gowns to bed, chosen for comfort rather than appearance. The Romans did not typically use what we would recognize as pajamas or nightgowns. The concept of specialized sleeping garments was not well developed, with the same basic tunic serving multiple purposes. However, there is some evidence that particularly fastidious or wealthy Romans might keep specific garments for sleeping, choosing softer fabrics or looser fits than their daytime clothing. Some sources mention the use of sleeping caps or veils, particularly for women, both to keep hair in place and to provide warmth. Personal grooming before sleep was relatively minimal by modern standards. Romans did not brush their teeth in anything like the modern fashion, though they were concerned with dental hygiene and used various tooth cleaning preparations made from herbs, salt, and abrasive powders. These might be applied to the teeth with a finger or a cloth, though this was probably more common in the morning than before bed. Hair was loosened from any elaborate daytime styling, with women in particular unpinning their hair and allowing it to fall naturally. Some might braid their hair for sleeping to keep it manageable and prevent tangling. The bedroom itself, called a cubiculum, required preparation for the night. In wealthy homes, slaves would prepare the beds, ensuring that mattresses were properly arranged, pillows fluffed, and blankets laid out. In simpler households, this work fell to family members themselves. The Roman bed, called a lectus or lectulus, was typically an elevated platform supported by a frame, often made of wood but sometimes of bronze in wealthier households. The frame might be simple and utilitarian, or elaborately decorated with inlays of ivory, precious woods, or metal ornamentation. The sleeping surface itself consisted of a mattress called a torus, which rested on a webbing of leather straps or ropes stretched across the bed frame. These mattresses were stuffed with various materials depending on the household's wealth. The poorest might use straw or dried leaves, which were cheap and readily available, but offered minimal comfort and harbored insects. Better mattresses used wool, which provided superior comfort and warmth. The wealthiest could afford mattresses filled with down or feathers, offering the ultimate in softness. Some sources mention that certain leaves, particularly those from specific trees, were believed to have beneficial properties, repelling parasites or promoting healthful sleep. Pillows were equally varied in their construction. Again, the filling materials ranged from straw for the poor to down for the rich, with wool representing a middle option. The Romans used multiple pillows, propping themselves at various angles rather than lying completely flat. This preference for an inclined sleeping position reflected both comfort considerations and the influence of the reclining position used for dining. Pillows were covered with fabric, sometimes simple and utilitarian, sometimes elaborate and decorative. Wealthy households might use pillows covered in expensive colored fabrics, even purple-dyed silk for the most ostentatious. Bedding, or coverings for sleeping, consisted primarily of blankets and coverlets. Wool blankets were most common, providing warmth even in cold weather. Linen sheets might be used in summer for their cooling properties. The wealthy might use multiple layers of covering, with fine linen sheets closest to the body and heavier wool blankets on top. In the coldest weather, fur coverings or additional woolen blankets might be added. Many Romans, particularly those of modest means, would use their outdoor cloaks as blankets, a practical economy that served double duty. In homes with multiple family members, decisions about sleeping arrangements had to be made. Married couples might share a bed, or surprisingly often sleep separately. Roman sources suggest that separate sleeping was not uncommon, particularly among the upper classes who had space for multiple bedrooms. Children typically slept in their own spaces, though young children might sleep near their mothers. Infants slept in cradles or small beds positioned near the parents. In multi-story insulae, where space was at a premium, entire families might share a single room, with sleeping pallets arranged on the floor or on simple elevated platforms. Slaves presented particular challenges for sleeping arrangements. House slaves might sleep in small rooms off the main living areas, in alcoves, or even in the same rooms as their masters if they needed to be available for nighttime service. Slaves who worked outside the house might sleep in cramped quarters attached to workshops or in communal slave housing. Field slaves on agricultural estates slept in rough dormitories. The quality of slave sleeping arrangements varied with the household's wealth and the master's disposition, but in general, slaves slept on simpler surfaces, with less bedding and in more crowded conditions than free family members. For those who could afford them, curtains around the bed served multiple purposes. They provided privacy in rooms shared by multiple people, protected against drafts in poorly heated homes, and kept out dust and insects. Some beds were equipped with permanent curtain frames, while others used simpler arrangements of fabric hung from hooks or rods. The curtains might be of simple cloth, or for the wealthy, expensive fabrics in pleasing colors. When the curtains were drawn closed, the bed became a private, enclosed space, a refuge within the larger household. Before finally settling to sleep, a cautious Roman might check that doors and windows were securely fastened, that fires were properly banked to prevent accidental blazes, and that valuable items were secured. This brief inspection of the household's security was both practical and psychologically comforting, allowing one to settle into sleep with confidence that basic precautions had been taken. In some households, specific prayers might be offered before sleep, brief petitions to the household gods for protection through the night hours, supplementing the evening religious observances performed earlier. The position for sleeping was typically on one side, sometimes alternating throughout the night. The Romans believed that sleeping on the left side aided digestion, making this the preferred position after the evening meal. The head would rest on pillows, with additional pillows sometimes used to support the body or to position limbs comfortably. The practice of sleeping with one's head elevated was considered healthful and was common enough that Roman beds and pillows were designed to accommodate it. Children were put to bed earlier than adults, particularly in families where the evening meal extended late, or when parents wished to continue evening activities without the distraction of children. The process of putting children to bed might include washing, changing into sleeping clothes, prayers, and perhaps a story or lullaby. Mothers or nurses attended to infants and small children, ensuring they were clean, fed, and comfortable before settling them in their cradles or beds. Older children might have more independence in their bedtime preparations, but would still be supervised to ensure they completed necessary tasks. With all these preparations completed, Romans could finally settle into their beds and allow sleep to claim them. The bed, carefully prepared, offered a space of comfort and rest. The household, secured and quieted, provided a safe environment for vulnerability and unconsciousness. The lamps, mostly extinguished, left only enough light to navigate if one woke during the night. In this carefully constructed environment, the transition from waking to sleeping could occur naturally, the body releasing the day's tensions and surrendering to the restorative power of sleep. The nature and patterns of Roman sleep. The actual experience of sleep in ancient Rome differed in interesting ways from modern sleep patterns, reflecting not only the absence of electric lighting, but also different cultural understandings of rest and different environmental conditions. Recent historical scholarship, particularly the work of historian Roger Ekirk, has revealed that pre-industrial societies, including ancient Rome, commonly practiced what is called biphasic or segmented sleep, a pattern quite unlike the consolidated 8-hour sleep period considered normal in modern industrial societies. In this segmented sleep pattern, people would typically go to sleep an hour or two after darkness fell, sleep for approximately 4 hours, then wake for an hour or two in the middle of the night before returning to sleep for another 3 or 4 hours until dawn. This wakeful period between what was sometimes called first sleep and second sleep was not considered insomnia or a sleep disorder, but rather a natural and expected part of the night. Romans used this wakeful interval for various purposes: quiet reflection, prayer, conversation with a sleeping partner if they woke, and sometimes more practical activities. The evidence for this sleep pattern in Roman culture is admittedly indirect, as Romans did not explicitly describe their sleep as segmented. However, various references in Roman literature suggest patterns consistent with this understanding. The phrase concubia nocte, sometimes translated as in the dead of night, actually refers to a specific period in the middle of the night and appears in context suggesting people might be awake at this time. References to dreams occurring at specific points in the night and to people rising in the night to tend to various matters all support the interpretation that Roman sleep was not always continuous. The natural rhythms of light and dark, unmediated by artificial lighting, would have encouraged this pattern. As darkness fell and the household quieted, the body's natural sleep processes would be engaged. After several hours, particularly if sleeping in a darkened room, the body might naturally rouse. This waking period, in the complete silence and darkness of the Roman night, offered a different quality of consciousness than either full wakefulness or sleep. Some might pray during this time, offering petitions to the gods in the stillness of the night. Others might simply lie quietly, allowing thoughts to drift. Couples might talk softly, discussing concerns, or making plans in the private darkness. For some Romans, this nighttime wakeful period offered an opportunity for activities that required quiet and solitude. Scholarly work might be conducted, with a lamp carefully lit and texts consulted. Pliny the Younger mentions rising in the night to work on his writings, suggesting that at least some Romans used these wakeful periods productively. Others might attend to personal concerns, compose letters mentally, or meditate on philosophical principles. The absence of daylight distractions and household noise made this time uniquely suited for concentration and introspection. The quality of sleep itself was affected by numerous environmental factors that differed from modern conditions. Temperature control was limited. On cold winter nights, Romans relied on wool blankets, the residual heat from braziers or hearths, and the warmth of sleeping partners or family members to stay warm. On hot summer nights, the stone construction of Roman buildings helped keep interiors cooler than the outside air, but comfort could still be elusive. Windows might be opened to catch breezes, though this also invited insects. The sounds of the city, while muted at night, never entirely ceased. Watchmen called out the hours. Distant sounds of revelry might carry from taverns, dogs barked, and the creaking of wagon wheels on stone streets reminded sleepers that some activities continued through the night. For those living in the multi-story insulae, additional challenges affected sleep quality. These buildings, often shoddily constructed and overcrowded, transmitted sounds easily from one apartment to another. Neighbors' conversations, crying children, late arrivals, and all the various sounds of human habitation could disturb sleep. The fear of fire, ever present in these buildings made largely of wood, might keep some awake and anxious. The upper floors, while cheaper, were also more dangerous in case of collapse, a not uncommon occurrence. These conditions meant that for many Romans, particularly the urban poor, restful sleep was an aspiration not always achieved. Dreams held significant meaning in Roman culture and were taken seriously as potential sources of divine communication or prophetic insight. This was not mere superstition, but a deeply held cultural belief shared across all levels of society, from emperors to slaves. Romans believed that the gods could communicate through dreams, offering warnings, guidance, or revelations about future events. Important decisions might be delayed until the person had slept on the matter and received dream guidance. Military commanders might consult their dreams before battle, politicians before making crucial decisions, and ordinary citizens before undertaking new ventures. Dream interpretation was a recognized art, with specialists who could analyze dream imagery and determine its significance. These interpreters, drawing on traditions that stretched back to ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, had developed elaborate systems for understanding dream symbols. A dream of flying might signify success in one's endeavors, while a dream of falling could warn of impending setbacks. Dreams of deceased relatives might be understood as actual visits from the spirits of the dead, carrying messages or requests from the underworld. Books on dream interpretation circulated widely, the most famous being the Onira Critica by Artemidorus of Daldis, a 2nd century work that cataloged and interpreted hundreds of dream symbols. The nature of one's dreams was thought to reflect both divine messages and the state of the dreamer's physical and mental health. Physicians, following in the Hippocratic tradition, paid attention to patients' dreams as diagnostic tools. Certain types of dreams might indicate fever, digestive problems, or mental distress. A person plagued by chaotic, disturbing dreams might be suffering from an imbalance of bodily humors that required medical intervention. Conversely, pleasant, prophetic dreams suggested a healthy body and a soul in harmony with the divine order. The timing of dreams was also considered significant. Dreams that occurred in the first part of the night, during what might have been the first sleep, were sometimes thought to be less reliable than those occurring in the hours just before dawn. This belief may have reflected the observation that early dreams were more likely to be influenced by digestion or the immediate concerns of the day, while later dreams came from a more profound level of consciousness. Some sought prophetic dreams deliberately through the practice of incubation, sleeping in temples or sacred sites in hopes of receiving divine visions, though this practice was more common in Greek territories than in Rome itself. Nightmares and disturbing dreams were taken seriously as potential omens or signs of spiritual disorder. Various protective measures might be employed to encourage good dreams and ward off bad ones. Prayers before sleep might specifically request pleasant and prophetic dreams. Certain herbs placed under pillows or hung near beds were thought to promote restful sleep and positive dreams. The Romans inherited from Greek tradition the concept of dream incubation, though this was more commonly practiced in temple settings than at home. Some afflicted with persistent nightmares might seek religious remedies, making offerings to appropriate gods or consulting with religious specialists. Sleep disorders, though not understood in modern medical terms, were recognized and discussed in Roman medical literature. Insomnia was acknowledged as a condition that could result from worry, illness, or other causes. Excessive sleepiness, snoring, and what might have been sleep apnea were all noted in medical texts. Physicians recommended various treatments, changes in diet, herbal preparations, exercise regimens, and adjustments to sleeping conditions. The understanding was fundamentally humoral, viewing sleep problems as resulting from imbalances in the body's fundamental qualities, but the observations were often quite acute, even if the theoretical framework differed from modern understanding. The transition from sleep to waking in the morning followed natural rhythms. Most Romans rose with the dawn or shortly thereafter, their bodies responding to the increasing light and the stirrings of the household and neighborhood. In homes where slaves were kept, these servants might rise even earlier to begin the day's work, lighting fires, fetching water, and preparing the morning meal. The sounds of their activity would gradually rouse the rest of the household. In modest homes without slaves, the necessity of beginning the day's work would pull family members from sleep, each assuming their roles in the daily routine. The sleep cycle thus completed, Romans would begin the day anew, having surrendered the night to rest and restoration. The quality of sleep profoundly affected how one felt and functioned during the waking hours. Good sleep was recognized as essential to health, clear thinking, and physical vitality. Poor sleep, whether from external disturbances, internal worries, or physical discomfort, could undermine one's capacity to meet the demands of the day. The careful attention to sleeping arrangements, the religious protections invoked, and the rhythms of the evening routine all reflected the understanding that sleep, while seemingly passive, was fundamental to the active business of living. The Roman night, with its periods of sleep, its wakeful interludes, and its final transition to dawn, represented a complete cycle distinct from the day, but essential to it. In the darkness and stillness, the human body performed its vital work of restoration and renewal. Minds processed the experiences of the day, just past, integrating them into memory and understanding. The household, barricaded against external threats, became a sanctuary where the most vulnerable state of sleep could be safely entered. And through it all, the household gods kept their watch, the sacred flame at the lararium casting its small light through the hours of darkness, a symbol of continuity and protection that would endure until dawn brought its renewed possibilities. Conclusion. The evening routines of ancient Rome, from the transition out of the day's labors through bathing, dining, religious observance, quiet activities, and preparation for sleep, reveal a civilization that structured its domestic life with both practical wisdom and cultural sophistication. These routines were shaped by the fundamental realities of pre-industrial existence. The absence of artificial lighting beyond simple lamps and torches, the seasonal variations in daylight hours, the dangers of urban streets after dark, and the limited resources available to most people for extending activity beyond sunset. Yet within these constraints, Romans created rhythms of life that addressed human needs for cleanliness, nourishment, social connection, spiritual grounding, and rest. The progression from the public world of the day to the private sphere of the evening, from the social space of the baths to the intimate environment of the home, from the shared meal to the solitary bed, followed a pattern that made sense of the transition from light to darkness, activity to rest, consciousness to sleep. These routines varied in their details across the social spectrum, but their fundamental structure united Romans across distinctions of class and wealth. The evening routines we have explored offer more than mere historical curiosity. They remind us that certain human needs and rhythms persist across vast spans of time and dramatic changes in technology and culture. The desire for cleanliness and its restorative effects, the central importance of the shared meal, the need for religious or spiritual practice, the value of quiet activities and conversation, the careful preparation for sleep. All these elements remain recognizable to us, though the forms they take have evolved. A Roman returning from the baths to dine with family, to honor household gods, to read by lamplight, and to settle into sleep was engaged in activities that, while different in their specifics, respond to the same fundamental human needs we experience today. There is something calming in recognizing these continuities, in understanding that the pursuit of comfort, nourishment, connection, and rest at day's end is ancient and universal. The oil lamps have been replaced by electric lights, the thermae by private bathrooms, the prayers to household gods by whatever spiritual or secular practices we maintain, but the rhythm of withdrawal from the day's demands and preparation for sleep continues. We still mark the transition from day to evening, still seek comfort in food and company, still prepare our sleeping spaces, still surrender consciousness to the restorative power of sleep. As you continue exploring the everyday lives of ancient peoples, as you seek to understand how they structured their time and met their needs, perhaps you'll find these glimpses into domestic routines particularly illuminating. If this exploration of Roman evenings has offered you moments of peaceful reflection or helped you appreciate the timeless patterns of human life, consider subscribing to the channel for more journeys into the quiet corners of history. And if you found this particular window into the ancient world conducive to rest and relaxation, a like would be most welcome. May your own evening routines, whatever form they take, bring you the comfort and restoration that Romans sought in their carefully ordered transitions from day to night, from activity to sleep, from the demands of the world to the peace of home and hearth.